starting with the scene animated growth 2, what we're going to do is now take a look at how we can control the materials for the landscape, and starting with the landscape, and also some additional controls for modifying the shape of the landscape. I'm going to start by creating a new layer. So I can just go to the No Layer, add a material, call it Landscape Grass, which is going to be the main material for the landscape. And I'm going to add this to a new layer, rename the layer Landscape. So now we have our own separate layer for all of the landscape materials. I'm going to go ahead and just drag and drop in a texture map that I'm going to use for the grass. So I have two materials, one for just an overall seamless grass, and another one that becomes a little bit rockier. So taking a look at the actual materials, or the actual textures, this is the seamless grass, and then the other one we're using starts to get a little bit rockier. And what I'm going to set up is a distribution between these two materials. We could use either alpha setups or just a mix directly within the material. Might as well just go ahead and rename this material. And actually, since we're in the landscape layer, we really don't need to put landscape in front of the name. So we're just going to have grass. The choice between a mixed fusion layer or a layered material to control the mixing, or to use an alpha, is going to depend on certain effects, mainly how you're planning on controlling the bump, whether that's going to be an overall change or also if you're going to be using any sort of displacement. Now we're also going to be setting up a sand layer to affect the bottom part of the landscape. So that one will definitely be controlled by an alpha. So these two, I'm going to go ahead and just mix together within the same material. So what we can do is now grab the material editor, and I'm going to go to the color of just the main grass and change this over to a fusion. And the blend channel, we're going to use ground texture, which we can choose from the loaded in bitmaps. I can now delete the additional material, and we're going to take a look at controlling the distribution of these two materials. So basically, we're going to be using a mask channel, so we're going to turn on the mask, and the way we want to control this is really going to be varied, depending on if you want just kind of an overall change or just using a noise, or we can use some more advanced types of controls. So what I'm also going to do is take this and apply it to the landscape. So replacing that previs that we had set up, and now loading in the landscape material. So we also need to modify the tag for that in order to change the tile amount. So how many duplicates we're going to have along each axis, which is also going to depend on the scaling and also the size of the texture itself. In this case, I have them a little bit wider than I do tall, so we would need to modify and increase the Y scale amount. But because we also have the terrain being stretched upward, we might need some additional amount of tiles on the Y-axis or the X, really depending on where the camera is placed. I'm also going to go ahead and add the landscape to that layer, to the landscape layer. And let's go over to the color. So I'm going to just minimize the attributes. And now we can control the mask. And what I'm going to use is an effect of the fall off. Now the fall off works kind of like a slope, but also with a bit of orientation that can be put into that. And it might be a little late to mention this now, but if you're not aware that you can collapse any of the panels, you can hold down Control and left click in order to control any of the panels and basically stack them and hide them. If you want to show and collapse everything except visible, you can set up some additional clicks. So if we selected Alt and click, it's going to collapse everything except that specific panel that you're clicking on, and it'll collapse everything else. Depending on which point of the view you're in, because you can see we have a divider here for my objects panel. So Control click works pretty well. Actually, I'm going to go ahead. We don't really need to have the clones on, so I'm going to turn off all of the clones. We are going to see the cloner object showing. So what we can do, let's see if we can hide all those. Unless the individual objects that are used within the cloner have an independent render setting or display setting for the viewport, you can go to the top in the cloner itself and just choose to disable it from the display. If you have the attributes open, you can just use selecting all of them, go to the basic, and then if it's visible in the editor, you can modify all of those at once. So that does make it a little bit quicker. Okay, so back to the fall off. The fall off, like I was saying, works basically like a level of slope in a way. I'm also going to go ahead and get out of the camera view just so we can move around the terrain to get a better sense of what it's going to look like overall. I'm going to go to the fall off and reset the gradient. Set up a new gradient. And right now, it's automatically set to go to 1. And we're having a very tight set of knots here. So what I'm going to do is set this to -1. We can work in the opposite direction. And I'm going to go ahead and invert the knots. We can start pulling down the other side. We have a lot of closeness between slope, so the way this is set up, even if we increase the overall value and set up different orientations, it might be difficult to really get a large range of space to work with. So we may just have to work a little closer here. But that's alright. So we're going to have the rocky areas in this case kind of showing it's like more on the flatter parts. So what I'm going to do is I kind of want to reverse that. Go ahead and change that around. We can go over back into the fusion and just invert the mask. So this way we have the rockier material showing on steeper areas, and then the grass showing on some of the flatter zones. So that's a pretty easy setup to use the fall off. What we can also do is if you want to start to bring in an orientation, so setting up an angle or sloping up the side of a mountain, you can start to bring in the other directions to limit which direction it's going to show on. If you're not seeing a result, you either need to decrease the intensity amount. Setting it to 1 is going to override most of the other settings. So now we can see more of the green headed in this direction. And we can increase that even more to adjust the effect, and also start moving in the other direction as well to limit it and kind of rotate around the terrain. So let's go ahead and set it -1, -0.1. And now we're going to see a lot more in this oriented area. So you can play around with that and kind of get some pretty nice setups pretty quickly. If you only have one direction set, then the output amount doesn't have a huge impact, but it will slightly impact it. As you can see, 0.1 as opposed to 1, or -1 as opposed to -0.1, has no change. Unless we started bringing in the other directions, it really doesn't matter if we're only working with one specific direction or axis. Now I do want to increase maybe the scale of the textures a little. So what I'm going to do is go over to the object tag, for the landscape, and just reduce the tiling amount. Now if you just want to do this per texture, let's say you want to have, or you have a different scaling setup between each of these textures. If you want to independently control them to tile separately instead of being part of the same material, which is one of the advantages of an alpha, it's pretty straightforward. But what we can actually do is the blend channel. If we use effects, we can go to the projector. The projector is going to set up an independent scale. So we're going to set the projection to be UVW, and we can increase the tile amounts. Also keeping in mind it does look like it is tiling the tiles. So if we wanted it larger, we would decrease. Use seamless if necessary. It might just be an OpenGL display difference, making sure that stacked materials is turned on. Even though they're not really stacked, it might interfere with it. So that does look like it's just an OpenGL change, or a display error on my end. So we can set this up independently. We have the other tag, I think it was 8 by, let's go ahead and take a look, 8 by 12. So this one, if we wanted to make the rock textures a little bit larger, we could do maybe 6 by 8. And although the OpenGL doesn't show it correctly, once we render, it will have that scale change. So that's a really nice way to be able to tile it independently and not have to rely on the same scaling for every single texture, especially when you have, if not every texture is square, or the details are different sizes. So I'm actually going to choose to bring this back to the texture. So I'm going to copy this texture, go back, and replace the projector. I'm just going to keep it set the same because we're mostly looking at the OpenGL, and that way you don't have to look at a bunch of tiling that's incorrect. We'll also go ahead and turn off the renders on those cloner objects. Now I also have an additional material I'd like to mix with the rock so that the tiling effect that is showing up, which is the repeating of unique areas of a texture, become very obvious. So what we can do is choose to use the fusion of that rock texture with another texture. So I'm going to open up, I'll go back to the materials and just drag in my other texture, which is a mix of grass and dirt. So it's a little bit more grass than there was before. We can copy this texture, go back to the main grass texture, under fusion, select which one we'd like to mix it with. The ground is and the main grass texture is pretty straightforward, so I'm going to go ahead and change the blend channel for the ground texture and change this over to fusion. And then we can paste onto the blend channel. I'm also going to choose to use a mask and set the mask to a noise. So we're just going to use a noise to mix between these two materials. I'm going to go ahead and minimize this so we can see it a little better. So all we need to do now is modify the noise. So I'm going to go ahead and switch over to the camera so that we can see the scale of the noise, also the textures, and switch over to changing the display to show the noises. And now we can modify the noise. We're going to set the space to object space, and we can choose from the different noises available in order to pick one that's going to give us a good blend. So I'm going to choose to use the dense. In the display, dense shows up in the second row, really depending on the size you have for your previews. And what I'm going to do is increase the octave amount to about 10. It's going to give us a lot more detail. And then we can adjust the scale to fit the texture a little bit better. So depending on whether or not you want to use it for additional channels, you can kind of keep that in mind. The more octaves we have, the more detail we can pull out of it. So the larger we can increase the scale of it without losing a bunch of detail. Also keeping in mind, too, that the output of rendering in the viewport will differ from rendering to the picture viewer. For this sort of a setup, it's not going to be all that different, but some of the details may not show as well. Now, if we're going to be using this for animation, and with a higher octave amount, really depending on how it's going to look in the back, with any camera movement, this is a definite change, and that's basically changing the detail attenuation to 1000. Really don't see that huge of an impact on the texture, so I'm going to keep it at 1000. And that's one thing to keep in mind for any noise that you're using, especially if you're running into any flickering problems with the noise during animation. That is the setting to change. So I'm also going to take this noise, copy it, and bring it over to the bump channel, and paste it. So we will need to modify contrast and maybe some of the other settings. For the detail attenuation, again, it's even more important on the bump channel than anything else because of the way it reacts with the light. I'm going to turn off the specular from the terrain, and then we can just modify the bump to fit a little bit better. And rather than adjusting the strength amount, which will affect any other channels we decide to add to the bump, so if we were to use another fusion, but still wanted a little more bump, what we can do is instead modify the contrast amount. So we can reduce the contrast. We could also reduce the brightness. It will start to flatten out when we're modifying the brightness. So if we need to, we can increase it to start raising through the bumps, and it will flatten out on the top again. So you might just have to kind of tweak around with it until you get it to a point that you want. If you still want to have the same look, you can just change the color amounts. So we could also just reduce that white to more of a gray, and that will also reduce the output. So that's pretty quick. If you want a reverse setup, and reversing the bump without having to use a negative strength, you can just swap these two colors. So color 2 would become the low point, changing that to black, color 1 being gray. I also want to take some of the details from the textures on the color and add those to the bump. So I'm going to copy that entire texture, go to the bump, and change the texture over to a fusion. And then we can fuse all of the color information along with that existing noise. Whether or not you want to use a bump is up to you. Or what you can do is just change the blending mode in order to make the two textures kind of overlay and interact with each other. So we can just kind of add to it by using the add. And keep in mind, too, the noise that's generated within the fusion is also going to be influencing the output. So you could choose to not use that other fusion, or you could use just one of the maps if you want to reduce maybe the amount of layers you have. If we go into this fusion, what I want to do is do the same thing before. Now this will adjust the mixing between the bump, but it'll give us a little bit of variation so it's not identical to the color. I'm also going to reduce the octave amount for this down to 8. So now we have a basic fusion set up. We could also use a different mode if we wanted to subtract to have a different output. Subtract may remove all of the information. So we'll just kind of go through and see which one's going to work the best for the current setup. And I am going to choose to use the add and stick with that, but instead reduce the noise output in order to decrease the intensity without affecting too much of the other layer. And then I'm going to increase the strength. And we just start to see a little bit more showing if needed. We can take a look at just the bitmap channel. Right now that noise is really intense, so if we look at just the bitmap, we can see how much of an influence we're getting from the other noise that's showing. For the most part, it's pretty much okay the way it is, so we could choose to just use the color, or just step down using normal mode to only very slightly starting to bring in the other noise. I think that for the bump output doesn't look as good, so I'm going to go ahead and change this over to Luca. And it looks like a lot of the original color is still showing. So we can create an additional mix that way as well. I don't think I want so much distribution on the bump channel in this case. So what I think I'm going to do is, instead of using all of these channels, just use the rock go back and paste that, so getting rid of the fusion altogether and just relying on the fall-off filter as the mask. And just blending that all together, just picking up on certain little hints. So that looks like it should work pretty well. Now I'm going to go ahead and turn off the noise preview just to increase the speed of the OpenGL. And we can also set up a diffusion of the entire layer to create, we could do a kind of a faked ambient occlusion, or we could process the ambient occlusion just by using the ambient occlusion effect that's available if you have the advanced module add-on. But before I get into any of that, I want to have the lighting more established first. So I'm going to hold off on that, and we're going to take a look at adding the sand. Now, there is one thing I should have kept in mind when I was creating the landscape. I wasn't originally intending to add the water to this scene. I did have it in mind for another scene, but it seemed to work well with this one. But basically, if we take a look and turn off the water, and what we can see is a very deep river. So if I want to reduce that depth and not have it as deep, without really severely modifying the landscape shape, we're going to need to make a few adjustments. And basically, what we'll need to do is go into the attributes of the landscape, and under Object. What we could do is use the sea level to basically clamp down and smooth out, flatten that area of the terrain. So the problem is that modifies the height by quite a bit. So what we can do is pay attention to where the starting point of the water is, or just grab a quick reference and just try to match that down a little lower. So it looks like that would line up with the marker for frame 75. We could also just switch to another viewport, which might help a little more. But I don't want to completely remove the area, just kind of start to flatten out the bottom a little bit more. So let's bring it up a little bit further. And because of the water level, so we're just going to remember 33, I'm going to bring that back. We want to take a look and also make a reference for not only the height, but also where it is intersecting with the terrain, so that we know how to adjust it. Now, one thing we could do is very easily render this out, set up a camera projection for the texture to match it up perfectly if you need to do that. The overall shape of the landscape I'm not too concerned about, because I really don't even have the placements of the clones finalized or anything like that. And since the all the objects that are populating around the water or repelled are linked to the water effector or the water object, we can just modify the water object or keep it where it is. Use it as a reference. It's not going to change anything. So let's use the sea level of 33, and I'm going to reduce the height, raise that up a little bit more. And just kind of get that to a point where it was before, or close enough. So that looks pretty good. So what I want to do is have sand showing underneath the water, and also around the edges, kind of sand banks. So we can set this up. I'm just going to start with a material, just a basic one, and we'll apply maps to it later, textures, or set up procedurals. I'm going to create a new material under landscape called sand. And I'm going to go ahead and change the color so we'll be able to see this a little bit better. turn off the specular channel for now, and make sure that under display you have stacked materials turned on in order to be able to see it in the OpenGL. And we're going to go ahead and just drag this on top of the landscape. So what we want to do is set up the alpha channel to subtract everywhere except around the edges of the water and below. So we can go over to the alpha channel, we're going to check it on, and under texture we're going to choose use the gradient. Be able to set this up pretty easily with the gradient. I'm going to switch over and use the 3D linear and also reset the start and end positions, just setting them all to 0. And what we can do is invert the knots and reduce the black point, but we still need to have a start and end point set up. So let's use the start at -5 and the end at 5. Now because the cycle is set, it's going to repeat itself over and over. And the original texture is, or layout, is right around the edge of the water bank, but we don't need the other additional copies. So we can turn off cycle, and it's only going to show it once. And now we can start to see that sand, and when we're set to the space of the object, we have the full length of the object, for the most part, within the gradient. So we can modify the end and start value and reduce its position. So -15 for the start and 5 for the end. We can see it coming up pretty well. So if we need to adjust, maybe tighten it up a bit if we don't want to have that much of a gradient and we want something a little sharper, we can just bring in that starting point of the gradient, or we can modify the start and end positions. Modifying the end is going to increase the size of the gradient, because the end is really kind of a way to stretch that out. So if you need to, you can increase that size, or you can just find a good position and start working with in modifying the gradient. And one thing you may notice in this setup is that we can start to see, and we are seeing, the material underneath the sand layer. So we'll need to make some modifications in order to get that to show properly. And it might just be a matter of adjusting these angles and just kind of fine-tuning it. Also making sure that we have white set for the color, and it looks like it was not white, and that's exactly why it was doing that. So we can go ahead and change that back to how we had it before. Okay, so now we have the sand placed, and we can modify the other values and change the bump settings and things like that. Before I move on, we can also modify the shape of the landscape in order to match a little bit closer to the shape of the sandbank. So what I want to do is go to the attributes first of the landscape. Let's go ahead and increase the amount of segments we have, so increasing the resolution. Let's go ahead and use 512 by 512. We can make other adjustments, minimal adjustments, without really changing the overall shape too much. So really depending on how much more you want to do with this. So let's go ahead and increase the fine furrows to 66. Rough furrows, bring down, let's bring it up to 55. So it's a little more of an interesting terrain. I'm going to go ahead and grab the camera and just reposition it a little now that there's those changes. Create the keyframe, making sure we're at 0. And what I want to use to modify the sandbank is the Displace Deformer. So we can add in the Displace Deformer, apply this to the landscape, and if we're going to be using the emulation mode, which I think in this case is going to be the easiest, just linking it to that sand layer, we can select the alpha, copy the texture, turn on the displacement, paste it, and then go over to the Displace Deformer, and under the attributes, turn on the emulation mode under Object. So now we can already start to see the changes being made. Depending on the mode you have, you can choose to raise the terrain up or lower it. Intensity Centered is going to modify everything for the white and the black. Black would need to be set to gray in order to not affect it. So in this case, we could set this up, or actually, it might even be the white. It does look like it was the black area. We can go ahead and set that to a mid-tone. 128 would be no effect, and that won't have any major effect on the terrain if you want to use that mode. Otherwise, you can go to Displacement and set it to Intensity, and the intensity is only going to shift one side of the gradient, so we can change that to black, back where it was before. If you want to fine-tune the look of it, we can change the gradient, so it doesn't have to be a perfect match. Now we do have a lot of change on the bottom, so we can go ahead and maybe raise that up instead, which right now is kind of flattening out the area a little bit more. So you can see in this case it's really just kind of overall creating a flat change. So we might need to modify the gradient. We can invert the knots. In this case, it's going to affect the upper level. Go ahead and raise that up. And what I want to do is just kind of create a sharper cutoff around the sandbank area. So we're just going to pull it out a little bit, and then it's going to drop down quite a bit to reach the bottom. So if you find that it is too flat by using that sea level, you can just kind of go back if you need to and reduce that level. What I'm going to do is increase the end of the gradient. And then we can fine-tune it a little bit more. And change the start value, really to get a lot of different outputs. If we want to add additional modification or reduce, we can change the white output. Another interesting effect is to add a black point before it to flatten it out. So now we have more of a sandbank that's already been eroded. And you could have it kind of look like it's dipping in. And then that height of the black is going to limit how high up the change is. And then we could also adjust the midpoints to curve that up a bit towards its center. Just some pretty neat stuff we can do with this. And then we can just adjust if we want to raise it up the start value. So I just want to bring it up, so I brought it from -15 to -14. And -13, we could raise it up even higher. So let's use -14. And like I was saying, if we want to smooth that out, we can adjust the different colors. So depending on the end, it will eventually start to dip down the entire terrain. If you want to add even more distortion, you can add turbulence. Because we have a very low res object, you would want to use this minimally. So a low setting with a higher scale, lower the octave amount, and just have a little bit of turbulence in there. So that's one way we could set up the displacement for the terrain, and also add in the sandbank. One other thing we could choose to do is, right now it's a very straightforward change throughout the entire terrain. If you wanted to create a little variation within that displacement and the way this is reacting, what we can do is use a fusion with that material. So going to the displacement, changing the texture over to fusion, and blending it with another either shader or setting up a gradient, a noise. I'm going to go ahead and use a noise. And we can kind of mix in between the two. So I'm going to set this to multiply. This will also add to the overall displacement of everything. So if you need to, and you don't want to modify anything else, just kind of within that range, because the gradient right now, the upper level, is set to kind of a grayer area, it's going to be more difficult to control that. So I'm going to bring that back to black and raise it up a little bit. And we can choose a different mode in order to just affect the light areas, which in this case burn is going to work pretty well. So we can go to the noise, and let's increase the scale to 250. And then I'm also going to display noises for the moment, just to modify this and increase the contrast, and also possibly use a different type of turbulence. Let's go to electric, which gives a pretty nice noise. And I'm going to turn up the Y to 150. And then also change that over to a world. And maybe we'll go ahead and use 350. For even more detail, what we can do is project the environment. But I think this is going to work out pretty well. We have some nice changes overall between the blending. So I'm going to turn off the show noises. And we're going to go over to the displace deformer. Now that we have the displacement, go to the refresh tab and turn off object. And that way the displace deformer is not constantly refreshing and taking up system resources, which will improve the speed. So now we have a nicer variation where the displacement is applied in some areas and not in others, but gives a little bit of a better look overall to the terrain. So starting with clone placement underscore 006 underscore landscape maps, we're going to continue the scene and take a look at creating a nice kind of sandy type dirt material, rather than just being a constant color for the sand. Also go to the material editor, which I do have the sand material still selected. And if you want to set up another material, basically doing the same thing with the fall off, modifying the bottom of the object, or the bottom along the bottom of our little river or water setup here. If you need to use the alpha to do that, one thing to keep in mind is the displace deformer that we have on the landscape will require, with the emulation mode, the topmost material. So it'd probably be better to set it up so that it's still the top and you cut out from the bottom and just place another material in between. And I do want to go ahead and change the naming of the landscape layer. You might have noticed earlier I did name it, or spelled it wrong, leaving out the D. So let's go ahead over to the bump channel. We're going to go ahead and turn it on, and actually we can start with the displacement and copy, or actually we'll go ahead and use the alpha, copy from there because we don't have the additional noise. And we're going to paste it on the bump channel and set to cycle. So we're going to end up with a repeat this time. And just want to make sure I didn't manipulate anything, because it looks like I lost my OpenGL preview. And now it is showing incorrectly, at least in the OpenGL. So what I'm going to do is disable the alpha for now. We should be able to get the bump to show correctly with that off for the moment. Now, in order to create sort of a sandbank type material, what I'm going to do is limit both ends of the bump using black on both sides, and then in order to create sort of an overlap, bring the white area a little bit closer to the left. So we can also change the start and end, and be able to change that a little bit more. Let's see if we can get a slightly better look to this. It's mainly looking like it's just not showing. I am going to set this to world space. See if we can get a change out of that. Change our start point to 0. But still not really getting any well, the kind of look I'm hoping to achieve here. It is possible that maybe this just isn't compatible with the bump. Thought I did it in the past, maybe not. So we're going to go ahead and use a different type of setup. We're going to go ahead and use a noise. And what we can do is change basically the axis, setting the X and Z to 0. We should be able to get a Y output if it doesn't look too terrible. Sometimes it's just not going to look all that great. So we'll go ahead and turn the alpha back on and see how that's going to look. So now I'm going to bring down the relative scale on the Y, and let's go ahead and bring it down to 15. And we should start to see, although incorrect in the OpenGL, it does show kind of a sandbank type look to this. So we can go ahead and take, I'm going to bring the object space, or change the space over to object, and see if we can get something that looks a little bit better. We probably just need to reduce the size. So I'm going to take the global scale and bring it down to 50. And the more we reduce that, the more we're going to start to see that showing, except all the way on the flattest part, because there's no angle, it doesn't work into the y-axis. So if needed, we might be able to get away with a very low value on the x and y, or the x and z, but it doesn't look like that's going to give us what we're looking for. So we'll have to just kind of fuse it together. I'm going to switch over to the camera. You can see the overall height a little bit better. Bring down the strength. Bring down the relative Y scale to 5. And if that's a little too much, maybe 8. Reduce our overall output. And if it's still a little too intense, we can take the color in the high point, and instead of using black, maybe use something in between, sort of a mid value. And it looks a little bit better. Maybe slightly lower. And then going back to the bump, we can also mix this with something else so that it's not exactly the same. We don't just have nothing on the flat area on the bottom. So under Effects, I'm going to use the Distorter. Might be able to get away with showing the noises now too, which might help show things correctly in the OpenGL, because before noises was not displayed. And if I need to, because it's starting to get more intensive with the scene, and since I'm recording at the same time to slow things down, it looks like it's just not properly showing at the moment. So I'm going to turn off noises, and what we're going to do is distort the noise with another shader setup. So we're going to distort this with a noise. And if you want to see what it currently looks like, we're basically bending and kind of twisting things around to match the new distortion. So we can set this up to distort to something a little more interesting. Really whatever's going to work best. We can go back to the dents for this one. And it doesn't look like we're getting really enough curvature. A little bit too much output for the most part. I'm going to reduce the contrast and the brightness so that it's not manipulating as much, and we should be able to get something that blends a little bit better. Also, if we need to, we might need to turn off if there is a cycle set up. So I'm going to turn off the wrap and just see how that looks. And we'll go ahead and keep that on, actually. So set it to cycle, and go back to the noise. And if we have to, just stick with kind of the basic noise to get it to look still really good. I think what I'm going to do is switch over to the blistered turbulence, reduce the Y scale to 50, set it up to object scale, and now we can see that distortion, and go ahead. I'm going to see how it's going to look if I increase the brightness and decrease the contrast. And that looks like it's going to work out pretty well. We just kind of fine-tune that to add a little more displacement to the overall setup. If we need to increase the octave amount, maybe to 7, increase the detail attenuation to 1000 to make sure that there's going to be no flickering in the animation. So now if we need to overlay anything on top of this, we can switch this over to Fusion. And for the blend channel, we're going to add a noise. I'm going to use the Luca object space 250 for the size. And then we need to set up how this is going to blend and how much influence. We don't necessarily need to set up a blending mode. If you set it to normal, it'll just kind of lay on top of it, adding an overall distortion to the entire bump, but still getting those finer lines, which doesn't look too bad. So then we got a nice little mix of both. I'm also going to go to that noise and turn on Use as Environment and project the environment. Which looks like it mostly removed everything, so if I need to reduce scale, we're just going to see how that looks. Just because it will give us a lot more detail, typically. But I'm going to turn that off for the moment, and go ahead and set that back to the way it was before. Increase the octave level to 8, detail attenuation to 1000, and there we've got a nice little mix. We can also go to the underlying layers. If we want to reduce the ring intensity, or the sand type intensity, what I want to do is first modify the relative scale. I'm actually going to increase the contrast a little, or increase the brightness and contrast slightly, and then we can just add more in order to remove the really dark points. So we got a little more bump in there. If it's still too much, we can just modify that and tweak it. So I'm going to bring that to 10. Actually, we'll go ahead and use a 9. 9 should be good. And then we'll just go ahead and leave it at that.